It has been about a year since I purchased the Triban 100 by Twin. Back then I was surprised by its low price of just €260 and the somewhat reasonable components you get for your money. Also, this bike just doesn't seem to look like a €260 bike. Since I bought the Triban, I've had multiple encounters where strangers on the street would ask me about my bike. When they heard it had just cost me €260, most of them just thought I had bought it as a used bike. After I changed to some proper road tires, someone even estimated the bike to be around €1,000. Now, of course, this guy probably didn't know a lot about bikes, but that just goes to show you how sporty this bike actually looks with its simplistic aesthetics despite its rather comfortable and city bike-like frame geometry. I bought this bike online and picked it up at a Decathlon shop. At first I was surprised by how good this bike was put together after hearing many complaints online about Decathlon not assembling their bikes correctly. It shifted well, the wheels were centered and the brakes were properly adjusted. But on my third venture with this bike, its handlebars got loose without any way of telling beforehand that this would happen. Something like this can get dangerous very quick, especially when riding at high speeds. But the blame is not to be put on the Triban 100 itself, but more on the job Decathlon did assembling this bike. It seems like their mechanics don't test drive this bike, which means the testing is up to you. But at least a warning sign to check this bike before riding would be appropriate instead of just handing this bike out to you, don't you think? So, if you're considering to buy this bike yourself, please check the screws, the shifter and especially the brakes before hitting the road with it. By the way, since I bought this bike, Twin has already released a newer version. It has a few changes like a new paint job and a few upgraded components, which I will address in this video, but overall this video should be applicable for the newer version as well. So, without further ado, let's jump straight into the components. First of all, the already mentioned frame is made out of aluminum and comes in at about 1.8 kg. Not the lightest, but acceptable. Something I really like about it though is that it comes in different sizes. You won't find this almost anywhere else at this price point. Like I already said, its geometry isn't that sporty, especially because of its high head tube. That doesn't mean you can't go fast on this bike, just that it's designed for a more comfortable ride instead of a more efficient one. It also has all the usual mounting points you need if you wanted to install a kickstand or a luggage rack. Something I wasn't that happy about was the steel fork the bike comes with. I would have preferred an aluminum one, but I guess they have to save the money somewhere. At least steel is a little more vibration dampening than aluminum, which might improve comfort on this bike, but definitively not its speed. Up front you will find a 420mm wide aluminum drop bar with a 90mm stem. The stem, just like on many other budget bikes, only has 2 instead of 4 screws to hold the handlebar in place. But I didn't have any problems with that yet. On the far left and right you will find Tektro brake levers that control the no-name dual pivot brakes front and rear. The levers are good enough for the bike, but the no-name brakes themselves aren't that great. They work and they are usable, but they don't really give you confidence, so I'd recommend changing these if you can. In the middle of the handlebar you will find the somewhat oddly placed shifter. This shifter is probably the biggest complaint I have about this bike, because in order to shift you have to switch your hand from the brakes to the shifter and then back. Now, if you only want to drive this bike on empty roads on the countryside, this shouldn't be too big of a deal. But if you just like me want to use this bike in the city, not having your hands on the brakes at all time can be a bit scary. In case you were wondering why there's only one shifter, it's because this bike is a one-by, meaning that it has no front derailleur like you'll see on most other road bikes, so all the shifting happens on the rear wheel. This was probably mostly done in order to save some money, because instead of a crankset you would usually expect on bikes like these, you have this somewhat odd looking one with plastic pieces for keeping the chain from slipping off. But despite its looks, it works, so I'm not complaining. At the back you will find a Shimano tourney rear derailleur. That's what's used by most bike manufacturers at this price point, so nothing special here. When it comes to the pinions used, I was a little disappointed with what came with my bike. The old version of the Triban, the one that I got, came with an outdated sprocket instead of a more modern cassette. But luckily, with the new version of the Triban, they actually changed to a cassette, which means that servicing or even upgrading your gears can be done far more easily. The gearing overall is actually quite good. Of course, at fast descents you might wish for a higher gear, or for doing some climbing you'd probably want a lower gear. But overall I'm happy with its performance, considering it brought me up almost every slope I threw at it. Front and rear the Triban 100 comes with wheels that are listed as Twin Sport 700s, but I suspect that they're just from some no-name brand with Twin's logo printed onto. But despite that and the fact that their finish is a little rough, I still like them. They ran true and they were well centered, and at this price point you can't expect much more. The only thing I found a bit odd was that, at least with the older versions, only the front wheel had a quick release. The rear one was fastened by one nut on either side, but again with the newer version of the Triban they fixed that so that now both front and rear wheel have quick releases. With the knobby 32mm wide tires the Triban comes with, You should be okay on most surfaces, and even some rougher gravel, just don't expect them to be as efficient as real road tires. When I tried the Triban on some rougher terrain, I was pleasantly surprised by how well the bike handled it. Of course, it was a little loud because of the turny rear derailleur, but the ride felt sturdy and it was actually somewhat comfortable. If I had to describe its driving characteristics in one sentence, I'd call it a simple all-round bike with a preference for the road. Overall, I'm quite happy with this bike. It seems like the money was saved in the right places, and considering Decathlon fixed most of the complaints I had with the first version, like the rear sprocket not being a cassette or the rear wheel being fastened with nut screws instead of a quick release, the bike seems to have become a lot better without any extra cost. The only thing that might not make this a suitable cheap bike for everyone is the shifter, which makes using this bike in a city a bit tricky. Also, you might want to temper your expectations a bit. This is still just a €260 bike, and the rule of you get what you pay for still applies. So please don't expect this to be as good as other, more expensive bikes. The only thing I didn't like at all, however, was the little attention the mechanics at Decathlon seem to pay to such cheap bikes. Like I already said, I think at least some form of warning should be required in order to inform the buyer. This is something you should definitively consider before buying this bike. In any case, I hope you liked this video. If you did, consider leaving a like. Any support helps a lot. Also, since I bought this bike, I modified it a lot. If you want to see a video about that, you can subscribe to my channel. With that said, thanks for watching and until next time.